Tonight on Critical Cult News, the Mormon mask of parental perfection fell apart this week when YouTuber mother Ruby Franke was arrested for child abuse. But first, is the Japanese government seriously considering dissolving the Unification Church there? And in Accountability Watch, we look at California's new coercive control law put into action. These stories and our analysis of the cultic influences tonight on Critical Cult News. Good evening and welcome to Critical Cult News, the weekly news program where we offer not only facts, but analysis of the cultic or coercive elements of those stories. Our first story looks at the Unification Church in Japan and whether it has a future there. The situation? Japan's government may ask its courts to order the dissolution of the Unification Church, according to an unnamed government source quoted in the Asahi Shimbun newspaper in Kyoto. Here's what happened. Last July, former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was assassinated by Tetsuya Yamagami, a man who said he held a grudge against the Unification Church and Abe for his political support of the controversial Unification Church. Church members are commonly referred to in the West as Moonies, since their founder and central figurehead was Sun Myung Moon up until his death in 2012. Since that time, the monolithic organization has splintered into various factions controlled by Moon's wife and children. Abe's grandfather, former Prime Minister Nobusuke Kishi, helped the ultra-conservative church establish a presence in Japan in the 1960s. Yamagami's trial for murder and other charges won't begin until next year. He told police he blamed the church for bankrupting his family after his mother, a member, donated more than 100 million yen, over $500,000 US, to the group 2 decades earlier. Abe was not a member of the church, but sent a congratulatory video message to a church affiliate in late 2021, in which he said he shared its belief in traditional family values. The government has been investigating the church, formerly known as the Family Federation for World Peace and Unification, over its fundraising activities, while battling a scandal over the group's ties to Japanese politicians, particularly members of Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party. According to the unnamed government source, the Japanese government inquiry has concluded that dissolution of this group is called for since the church has engaged in, quote, vicious, organized, and continued, end quote, activities that outweighed its constitutional right to religious freedom. An attitude we'd like to see a lot more of in Western nations, where so-called religious freedom has been used as a shield for criminal operations to hide in plain sight as supposed religious organizations. According to reporting from major Japanese news outlet Mainichi Shimbun, the courts can utilize religious corporations law to issue a dissolution order if an organization has committed acts that are clearly recognized as, quote, being substantially detrimental to public welfare, end quote. Groups that are dissolved or stripped of their status as a religious corporation lose their exemption from corporate and property taxes, as well as a tax on income from monetary offerings. Shiori Kano, a lawyer on the Consumer Affairs Agency panel looking into the church's sales practices, said being stripped of its status as a religious organization would not limit the church from continuing its activities or its members from meeting. Government dissolution would not end the belief set nor forbid the members from incorporating a new group. The Aum Shinrikyo doomsday cult, guilty of attempted mass murder using sarin gas in 1995, renamed themselves into Aleph, where they continue to this day recruiting members and soliciting donations. However, this dissolution is not a futile gesture and would indicate under no uncertain terms that the Japanese government's open support of the Moonies is at an end. Current Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida may be hoping this dissolution would quell criticism of his party's ties to the church. In the months after Abe's death, the media uncovered evidence that politicians across the ideological spectrum had ties to the group, from giving speeches at church-sponsored events to enlisting followers to work on election campaigns. Some members of Kishida's party have reportedly cautioned against dissolution, however, fearing that the government could be accused of trampling on religious freedoms. Testimony by former members, court rulings in civil lawsuits, and church documents showed the group demanded huge financial donations through, quote, spiritual sales, end quote, in which followers are pressured into buying trinkets and small items at exorbitant prices. This only touches on the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the abuses the Unification Church is reportedly responsible for around the world, from claims of human trafficking and money laundering to political influence peddling and even gun running. Founded in South Korea in 1954 by the self-proclaimed Messiah Sun Myung Moon, the church has established a global presence, with Japan proving fertile ground for converts and their donations. The Moonies claim to have 600,000 Japanese followers, although admitted only about 100,000 are active, and have collected nearly $1 billion in donations since 1987. In that time, the national network of Lawyers Against Spiritual Sales, which represents people who claim they have suffered financial damage because of the church, have generated 35,000 compensation claims. Japan was one of the first destinations in the Moonies' international expansion, and it remains the fourth largest congregation out of the church's 10 million global members. The church says Japan is its largest source of income. Japan has around 180,000 registered religious organizations, but only 2 have received dissolution orders. The Om Supreme Truth Doomsday Cult mentioned earlier, and the Myokakuji Temple Group, whose leaders were accused of defrauding followers. This move would be unprecedented in the history of the Unification Church. The Japanese public are reportedly fed up with the Moonies, and rightfully so. They are a high-control group which uses religion as a cudgel to make money for the Moon family, control people's lives, and destroy families. Before his death in 2012, Moon was personally responsible for creating generations of abused children raised by parents who didn't even know one another before Moon forced them to be married in bizarre mass weddings, which so many people laughed at but never understood. Not until the children of those wedding couples started speaking out was it understood just how awful their upbringing was, with years of religious abuse and trauma they suffered at the hands of those same parents, inflicting physical and psychological abuse under the guise of raising perfect offspring. And that was just one aspect of a litany of criminal actions Moon ordered or encouraged, including the labor trafficking of children packed into vans, driving back and forth across the U.S., selling trinkets, starving and even beating those kids if they didn't perform, while sending the profits straight to Moon's bank accounts. Make no mistake, Sun Myung Moon was a human predator writ large, who had his picture taken with U.S. presidents and used his power to create propaganda machines and endless sources of profit for his family, such as taking a piece of the entire worldwide sushi industry. His Moonie cult is one of the most dangerous and destructive this world has ever seen. It continues to thrive to this day, with one of Moon's sons now having created a church which incorporates the worship of assault rifles as part of its cultic dogma. It is well past time for national governments to get to work, kicking out corrupt members who do the bidding of cult leaders and enforcing laws that were designed to protect its citizens, not enrich criminals hiding behind religious scripture. If Japan dissolves the Moonies there, that would be a very important step forward in the worldwide fight against cults. And now we turn to Accountability Watch, our recurring segment of reporting on anti-cult and coercion legislation around the world, this time in California. The situation? In 2020, California Governor Gavin Newsom signed Senate Bill 1141 into law, one of the first laws in the United States explicitly defining coercive control as it relates to domestic violence in family court matters. This law is now being tested in action. Here's what happened. In Accountability Watch, we take a hard look at laws, regulations, or measures taken to bring to heel abusers and predators, whether in domestic or family situations, or more broadly to gangs, cults, and larger groups. So it is that in 2020, California joined a small handful of other states in enacting legislation to protect victims of domestic abuse under the description of coercive control, defined specifically in California now as, quote, a pattern of behavior that unreasonably interferes with a person's free will and personal liberty, end quote. This pattern does not require assault or physical abuse in order to be considered a violation. So such activities as restraining social relationships, forbidding financial independence, limiting or restricting a partner's movements or travel, and a plethora of other nonviolent but controlling and abusive practices can now be considered in family court to be justification to issue restraining actions against the abusive partner. While this does not carry the same weight as a criminal charge, it is a first step in protecting abuse victims who previously had no legal recourse at all. Laws are enacted all the time, but the mere passing of a law does not in and of itself mean much of anything until it is tested in the real world. And so it was that on August 10th, less than a month ago, Judge Vanessa Zecker of the Santa Clara Superior Court entered a permanent restraining order against a man for coercive control domestic abuse. Lisa Fontes, a professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, an expert on coercive control, said, quote, this case is one of the first cases in the United States where coercive control was considered domestic violence in the absence of physical abuse. The judge essentially said a marriage license does not give a person permission to subjugate their spouse, end quote. So what happened for this restraining order to be issued? The details are quite bad. According to Rebecca Fry, attorney for the wife, coercive control is the, quote, micro-regulation of everyday life, such as monitoring phone calls, dress, food consumption, and social activities. Fry described the husband's hundreds of pages of detailed mandates and nightly meetings to enforce them as militaristic, leaving no margin for flexibility or freedom to deviate from the imposed mandates. As part of their marriage, the husband gave his wife pages of instructions and demands about how she had to behave. In her ruling, Zecker described how the husband used, quote, written documents, edicts, and pronouncements, end quote, to control his wife's every move, right down to the way she was supposed to wash the dishes. These were not just written suggestions posted on the refrigerator door, but what the judge said were, quote, directives which literally control every aspect of the petitioner's life, from how she cooks and keeps the house, including the kitchen, to the times which things need to be done, and preempts her from engaging in any decision-making in her own home, end quote. Part of these mandates included an evening meeting every night at 8:30 p.m. to discuss whether she had met his demands. In the documents, the husband complained of his wife's, quote, transgressions, including waking up a few minutes later than promised and getting breakfast on the table a few minutes later than promised, end quote. The wife testified that her husband's behavior was, quote, demoralizing, demeaning, and exhausting, end quote. The judge found the man's behavior was coercive control domestic violence because it impeded his wife's right to freedom of thought, action, and decision-making. The husband, quote, engaged in a pattern of behavior which controlled and regulated his wife's daily behavior, communications, and economic resources, and engaged in a pattern of domination, intimidation, and deliberately impeding the rights of his wife, end quote. When a human being has to worry about or consider an intimate partner's reaction in every facet of their life, including whether the intimate partner approves of that action, then that human being really is not free in either decision-making or movement, Zecker said of the ruling. This is where the line is crossed from micromanagement or an attempt to control external circumstances to the control of another human being, or coercive control, end quote. Of note is the judge's attention to the details of the language the husband used when it came to threats of punishment. Quote, whether intended or not, the use of the words punishment and violations have no place in a spousal intimate relationship, and the use of those words have the effect of creating a circumstance where the victim's spouse is emotionally battered, to the point where the lines are blurred between what the victim's spouse really wants versus what the victim's spouse believes will please the other spouse to avoid an argument or to avoid being placed in a financially desperate situation with a child, end quote. Fortes suggests that a judge referring to someone as emotionally battered in itself is groundbreaking and may have implications for future rulings. This is not freedom of thought, Judge Zecker continued. The lack of freedom of thought leads to the lack of freedom of movement. Respondents' actions amounted to a denial of petitioner's free will in almost all aspects of her life, end quote. Particularly excruciating for the wife was how her husband required her to use force if their daughter was not immediately compliant with his rigid requirements for brushing her teeth, using the toilet, going to sleep, and getting dressed. At one point, he blocked the mother from comforting her child by standing in the doorway of the child's bedroom and refusing to let her pass. Coercive control harms children as well, Fry argued. Quote, "We don't want these kids growing up thinking that this level of micromanagement and control and fear of punishment is normal. We have to break that cycle for these kids," end quote. The judge entered a domestic violence restraining order against the husband and maintained a sole legal and physical custody of the child with the wife. The father will continue to have unsupervised visitation with the child pending future court hearings. As Fry told Ms. Magazine, having laws that explicitly address coercive control helps judges see and understand this behavior as harmful. Quote, "I have been working on domestic violence cases for most of my career, about 28 years, and there's always a component that had no label. It was called financial abuse. It was called emotional abuse, or even psychological abuse, or gaslighting. Now we have something that encompasses what it's like. Having that label brings a difficult-to-prove element to the forefront of the minds of the judicial officers that we're in front of, giving them something tangible," end quote. In the last 3 years, 5 states have passed down coercive control laws: Hawaii, California, Washington, Connecticut, and Colorado. Another 10 states and the District of Columbia have laws that cover coercively controlling behavior. These laws usually relate to protective orders and/or family law. Many more states are considering coercive control legislation, including Massachusetts, New York, Illinois, Maryland, Virginia, Vermont, and New Jersey. These are all positive moves forward in bringing abusive partners to justice, even when there are no physical scars or bruises to show such abuse is happening. But make no mistake, domestic partner violence is an all too common problem across the United States, and coercive behavior adds another layer to this awful mix. Domestic abuse of any kind is one of the most difficult types of cases for law enforcement and judges to prosecute due to the psychology of victimhood and how victims are often trapped in a codependency with their abuser, feeling they need to get away, but at the same time, feeling they can't live without that person. This applies across genders as well and is not just a male to female problem. Cases of women who coercively control men are often hidden behind layers of toxic masculinity and cultural misunderstandings about what is and isn't abusive behavior between the sexes. Until education catches up with the generations of ignorance that has been foisted off on society about how abuse is acceptable and how even spanking children is a necessary act, these problems of coercive behavior will continue to plague us. However, the states we listed earlier are taking this seriously, and change is happening. The barriers to moving this legislation from civil to criminal courts are many, and the path is complicated by not just passing laws, but overcoming the fixed ideas of our culture and societies, including those of some prejudicial judges who still don't seem to understand that just because someone is staying in an abusive situation, that doesn't mean they want to be there or can just walk away from it. Ignorance remains our chief foe in this battle, and that is why stories like this must be talked about and the consequences of domestic abuse understood across the mainstream. Until it is, we will continue our accountability watch. And For our third and final story this evening, we turn again to Utah and the influence of the Mormon Church on mothers who are now in jail for abusing their children. The situation? On August 30th, 2 Mormon YouTube influencers and parenting coaches in Utah were placed under arrest and are facing 6 charges of aggravated child abuse. Here's what happened. Ruby Franke was once the popular and well-known face of the 8 Passengers YouTube channel, which followed the lives of Ruby, her husband Kevin, and their 6 children. More than just a life channel, 8 Passengers offered advice on how to raise children using methods of discipline many called harsh, overbearing, and even abusive. And over the past 3 years, the family has been in a downward spiral, with the marriage partners separating and Frank then going into business with friend and neighbor Jody Hildebrandt. The newest and most disturbing chapter in this story happened last week. According to a statement issued by the Santa Clara Ivins Public Safety Department, one of Frank's 6 children climbed out of a window at the Ivins, Utah residence of Jody Hildebrandt. The child ran to a neighbor's house to get help and asked for food and water. The neighbors noticed that the child had duct tape on their ankles and wrists and decided to call the police. The child was taken to the hospital and treated for, quote, severe, quote, wounds and malnourishment. Shortly after the first child escaped the Hildebrandt residence, a second malnourished child was found in the same house. According to officials, they were, quote, in similar physical condition of malnourishment, end quote. The second child was also taken to the hospital for treatment. A search warrant led to the discovery of evidence consistent with the kids' wounds, and 4 minors were taken into care by the Department of Child and Family Services. It was found that mother Ruby Franke had filmed a YouTube video from that same house just days before the arrest, which officials stated, quote, adds to Ms. Franke being present in the home and having knowledge of the abuse, malnourishment, and neglect, end quote. While this is the first incident of police intervention following evidence of child abuse, the Franke family has faced criticism for years for the parenting style they actively promoted on their YouTube channel. Rumors of child abuse started circulating in the summer of 2020, when one of the children disclosed in a vlog that he had his bedroom taken away after playing pranks on his little brother and was sleeping on a beanbag for months. The channel had about 2.5 million subscribers at its peak, but was taken offline earlier this year for unknown reasons. Frank then splintered off to a different channel last year, and certain family members disappeared from view altogether. This prompted some watchers to start investigating for themselves and finding red flags, such as Frank refusing to bring a packed lunch in for her 6-year-old daughter because the daughter forgot to pick it up before school. At the time, the Frankes pushed back on the narrative, accusing the internet of stirring up drama and taking clips out of context. According to reporting from Insider at the time, the Division of Child and Family Services in Utah closed their investigation because claims of child abuse were unsupported. Following this controversy, Frank's uploads became less frequent and then ceased altogether. The channel was removed shortly after. But in June of 2022, Franke announced she was forming a new channel called Connections with Hildebrandt, who has her own troubling history. As a therapist, Hildebrandt's license was put on probation by the Utah Clinical Mental Health Counselor Licensing Board for 18 months in January 2012 for violating a patient's right to confidentiality when she discussed their porn addiction with elders at their Mormon church without permission. According to the patient, quote, she just lied wherever she went to further an agenda to destroy my life, end quote. The Connections channel Franke and Hildebrandt started drew immediate criticism, and some even called it a cult. While they described their channel as a mom's support group and claimed to help treat those lost and stranded in the darkness of distortion, which addictions, fear, sadness, and all other self-destructive behaviors derive from, the teachings they offered were criticized as damaging, extreme, and authoritarian. For example, In one Connections video, Franke and Hildebrandt offered numerous reasons to not listen to your children and that children do not deserve privacy. The videos were packed with homophobic, transphobic, racist, and ableist comments. The most common theme throughout seems to be the Franks' parenting style is harsh and authoritarian, and punishments are given out which are grossly disproportionate to the misdeeds of the children. Psychologists, child advocates, and mental health experts have stated for years that severe discipline of this kind can develop a poor sense of self-worth, broken attachments, and a fear of abandonment in children. It can also lead to the child not really understanding what they did wrong and repeating the behavior, creating further strain on the parent-child relationship. In Utah, the definition of aggravated child abuse includes starvation, broken bones, head injuries from hitting or shaking, and suffocation. If intentionally inflicted, the perpetrator faces up to 15 years in prison and a fine of up to $10,000. Franke's estranged eldest daughter, 20-year-old Cherie, has been posting about her family and the channel on Instagram for a few years. She said once she moved out of her home to attend college, she began realizing her parents' methods were too extreme. When the news broke of the arrest last Wednesday night, Cherie shared a photo of a police car on her Instagram story with the word, "finally." In another post, she wrote, quote, "Today has been a big day. Me and my family are so glad justice is being served. We've been trying to tell the police and CPS for years about this, and so glad they finally decided to step up." End quote. Kevin Franke, the father, was also once involved with Connections, but has been out of the public eye for several months. A statement from his attorney made it clear Kevin does not live in the same household as Ruby, and he claims he was not aware of the levels of physical abuse she and Jody were inflicting on their children. Time will tell if this is true, but we at CCN are taking everything this man has to say with a bucket load of salt. The sad fact is that parental abuse is an all too common occurrence. But when such abuse is disguised as a kind of helpful parenting and actively promoted on platforms such as YouTube, we are facing a cultural problem of magnitude. Many neighbors and family claim to be aware of some aspects of the Franks' child abuse and tried for years to get the attention of law enforcement and social services, but no one would investigate deeply enough to take action, even when the red flags of the abuse were being seen by millions of viewers. There is a kind of very sick irony to that, which simply cannot be swept under the rug or ignored any longer. Not in a society which prides itself on guaranteeing human rights to all its citizens. Children are citizens too. Raising children according to most cult rule books involves physically beating the children to break their will, psychologically tormenting them to establish dominance, and rigidly controlling their every action and even thought. Parents who are in a cult mindset consider children to either be possessions to be owned and controlled, or as mini-me's to fashion and mold in their parents' image, or dismissed as a troublesome bother they don't have time for because they're too dedicated to their fanatical cause. Uniformly in cults, from one to another, children are thought to not deserve to be treated with humanity or kindness or love. These concepts are wholly alien to a cultic way of thinking. Cult leaders want this because they are traumatized, abusive personalities who couldn't spare a kind thought for another human being if their life depended on it. To such people, children are mainly viewed as either distractions to be swept aside or pack animals to be exploited. This is the reality of life for children in cults, and it doesn't particularly matter which one I'm referring to. In the case of the Franks, they used Mormon principles, but clearly not every Mormon is an abusive parent who uses duct tape to bind their children's hands and feet, nor do they habitually not feed or care for their children. It takes a true psychopath to treat one's children that way, and it may well be that Ruby Franke and Jody Hildebrandt are such psychopaths. But make no mistake that while the Mormons may not have been the sole cause for this abuse, the Mormon community and the Mormon belief set didn't stop this from happening for all the years these kids were being exploited, even as they were being used as fodder for a YouTube channel. Don't just look on when you see abusive behavior on your screen. If you are seeing signs of parental abuse in a video, those are just the parts the parents want you to see. What else do you suppose they might be getting up to when the cameras are turned off? If the Franke family is any example, they're getting up to quite a bit. And with that cautionary note, we end our news show tonight. Thank you very much for watching. If you have found this educational, informative, and entertaining, please like and share this video and get it around on the internet and tell other people about this channel. Thank you very much for watching, and good night.